My name is Jesus Castro-Balbi. On behalf of the Yale Club of Fort Worth, I'd like to welcome you tonight. The Yale Club of Fort Worth seeks to bring you programming that is inclusive, engaging, and builds community. Today, we thank our partners, sister organizations who made this presentation possible. The University of Michigan Club of Dallas, the Princeton Club of DFW, and the Yale Club of Dallas. Thanks to these organizations and to their leadership. North Texas is a thriving economic center. And yet, poverty is the daily lot for many in our community. To improve the world around us, we must educate ourselves on the wonders as well as on the challenges in our area. Therefore, we must recognize and try to understand poverty. Over the next hour, you'll hear from some of the foremost experts in the field and from a leading practitioner locally. Our own Dr. Marie Kelly, Yale MD class of 1974, will guide the conversation. Dr. Kelly completed 2 residencies at UT Southwestern Medical Center in psychiatry and OBGYN, where her patients lived on $2 a day. Dr. Kelly worked in private practice as an OBGYN consultant to the county health department and served on the faculty of UT Southwestern Medical School, where she was a volunteer teacher to medical students in the psychiatry department for 20 years. Additionally, she volunteered teaching at JPS Hospital in Fort Worth. She retired from private practice in 2014. Dr. Kelly, would you like to take it from here?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Castro-Balbi. The Yale Club of Fort Worth got interested in $2 a day because the book club read it. And it's a very good book. I recommend it. It's a scholarly book. It's very well researched, very well written. But it's also very human. It's a very human story of a group of people who have fallen completely below all of the safety nets. It's a short book. It's less than 200 pages, so you can read it in a few hours. And it's worth a read. We are lucky to have the authors of $2 a day, living on nothing, almost nothing in America, Dr. Kathryn Edin, a professor at Princeton, and Dr. Luke Shaefer, a professor at the University of Michigan. In addition, we have our local poverty specialist, Ms. Kathryn Arnold, who is the CEO of Pathfinders. Pathfinders is located in Tarrant County, where the Yale Club of Fort Worth is located. And it is an outstanding nonprofit that focuses on taking people in poverty and trying to help them find employment and housing and lift them out of poverty. And they have a good success rate about it. And so hopefully she'll be telling us some about that. She knows a lot. Ms. Arnold worked as a social worker for many years before she became CEO. And she knows a lot about poverty in North Texas and Tarrant County in the state of Texas. Dr. Kathryn Edin has studied poverty for years and written 8 books. And Dr. Shaefer has been a poverty researcher and educator for many years. And he's the director of Poverty Solutions. So we're going to start. Oh, by the way, any questions you have, just put them in the chat and we'll answer questions at the end. I'm going to start with Dr. Edin and Dr. Shaefer, and hoping you can tell us a bit about what it was like to write the book, and your favorite and worst parts of it, and also what are the most important parts of the book? What's the take-home message? What do we really need to remember? So, who wants to start?
Luke?
Well, it's great to be with all of you, and neat to see all of these alumni clubs come together, Princeton and U of M. Yale, which I think is the only Ivy League that Kathy Edin hasn't been a professor at yet. I'm still a data nerd. I love charts, and a nice graph just makes me feel warm and cuddly inside. And I came into this project having done that kind of work really from the comfort of my office. I was actually, like Miss Arnold, a caseworker sort of early in my career, but after seeing so many families coming in, having trouble paying their rent or utilities and sort of constantly negotiating that, I wondered if there was something that I could do structurally to change the policies so that to help people who were doing the work of helping those families not have quite so many who are running into trouble. So that got me into the academy, and that's where I learned of the love of data and figuring out how to use data to figure out how your programs are working and how they're not. But of course, Kathy was doing a very different kind of research, which was rather than trying to answer questions about poverty in America by looking at her computer screen, she would go out and talk to people, which is self-evident to everyone else in the world and a little novel in the academy. And so we really combined forces on this project. This was not a project that either of us sought out. I was expressly doing studies about the working poor, actually, which, as we learned through this book, is not so different a group, actually, many of the times from the one that we got to know. But Kathy, when we first met, told me about going into people's houses, not looking for it, and just seeing these families who were surviving on no money. So they might have food assistance, sometimes a housing subsidy, although that's quite rare. In my community, it's actually harder to get into Harvard than it is to get a housing voucher. The approval rate, the acceptance rate is much lower for a housing voucher. But food assistance is common, and public health insurance is common. That's actually an interesting sort of phenomenon where you have all of these families with no money, but they have public health insurance, which we actually spend a lot on as a nation. So I was sort of taken by her observation, having read all of her other books. Kathy's written 8 books. I've written 1 book. I've co-written 1 book, but we don't get too concerned about the numbers. So I started to look at every sort of piece of data that I could find. Household surveys, administrative data from our food assistance programs. We checked in with agencies, and everywhere we went, we saw this huge increase in the number of families who just didn't have any money. And they were trying to survive on food assistance. Sometimes maybe they didn't have that. And that got us really interested in what that meant. And so that book, that sort of statistical work, trying to look across every source of data to see this real pattern going on, this really concerning pattern from about the late 1990s to the 2010s, when we saw a doubling. In some data, it was a tripling, whereas we see something along the lines of about 3 million children who were in families experiencing a month or a calendar quarter or a whole year, just in these very, very low incomes. And all those data, if anybody used data knows, they're imperfect. When they all point to the same thing, something's going on. And so we decided to try to learn more about that. So we got to know families in Chicago and Cleveland and Appalachia and then the Mississippi Delta. And we asked them to tell us their stories and promised to tell them in an honest and respectful way. And that's where I really know. I'm gonna hand it off to Kathy in a second, but I just wanted to say that's where I really began to understand that sometimes, from the comfort of my office, I think I did a lot of great work before. Well, I don't know if it was great, but it was reasonably good, we'll say, work from my office in Ann Arbor. looking at data and trying to figure out how programs work and how they fall short. But from that positionality, even from somebody who had done the work before, even from somebody who had grown up without a lot of money, I can say that before you actually go out and connect with people and really ask questions, start with asking questions before assuming that I had all the answers, I think sometimes I didn't even know the right questions to ask. And so that's where this work of connecting with families and really following their lives and trying to understand them, I think shows this incredible value that if we want to have any chance of understanding the challenges of poverty in America today, that's a central piece of it. So Kathy, maybe you can tell folks a little bit about what we found.
So my first book was written before welfare reform, before the 1996 welfare reform. And back then, I actually toured the country for 6 years talking to low-income single mothers about how they made ends meet. It's my 20s. It was an amazing experience. But back in the day, when I was writing my first book with Laura Lane, Making Ends Meet, if you were needy, you knocked on welfare's door and you were guaranteed a benefit. So in the 2010s, when I started knocking on doors in Baltimore for a completely separate project and realized that there were people who were categorically needy, but were living on no cash income, I was shocked. And I said to myself, could it be that in the aftermath of welfare reform in the world's most advanced capitalist economy, there were people living with no cash? And if so, what did that mean for their health, their well-being, and their ability to move out of poverty? So as Luke said, I met a couple of families and I thought, was this real? And Luke's exhaustive, beating down the door of every data set in the country, again and again produced the same answer, a doubling or even a tripling since the early 90s of folks in this category. So what was the cause? And that's when we started touring the country, talking to families and following them for many months and years. And the stories they told really revealed sort of a three-legged stool of causes. The first was in the aftermath of welfare reform, you didn't have to give people a benefit, even if they showed they were needy. And states stopped doing it. And so, get your head around this fact. In 1994, there were about 14 million people on cash welfare. So that was right before the reforms. The last time I gave this talk, there were 3.6 million people on a cash welfare. In September of 2020, during the height of this pandemic, there were only 2.7 million people, mostly children, on cash welfare. So just a precipitous decline. And one thing we learned in talking to our families is welfare had become so rare, cash welfare became so rare that when people had need, they didn't even think of applying for the program. So we were waiting with Travis Compton in Johnson City, Tennessee, for the sheriff's deputy to come and evict the family. And Travis was actually looking out the window, and I said, I don't know if it was Luke or I who just finally couldn't resist. And we said, Travis, he's got his wife, Jessica, there, his two little girls. Why don't you go apply for cash welfare? And he looked at us and he said, what's that? He'd never even heard of the program. So this death of welfare, not only in terms of the numbers, as states got more flexibility, they started spending the money on other things, like child welfare, or college scholarships, or all kinds of other things. It really became a slush fund for states when they ran short of things they wanted to do. But in the meantime, really the program fell apart. And it fell apart in the minds of the people who would be eligible for it. So the second leg of that stool of causality was work. So when we started this project, we thought, as Luke alluded to, that there were might be two groups. There might be this $2 a day poor group and there might be the working poor. But we soon learned, looking at this data, to the stories of our families, that almost everybody who fell into a spell of $2 a day had done so after losing a job. And a very, very high proportion of the children living in $2 a day families had a parent who had worked in the labor force in the past years. So there was this saturation in these stories of striving to find work, to keep work. There was this idea of being a worker that was very significant to people. They were not dependents, they were workers. So that was very an intense part of their identities. But just as, you know, in social policy, we said, we're going to reform welfare and send all these people into the labor force. The low-wage labor force also started to fray. And so if you look in the data, you see a rise in unsafe work conditions. You see a rise in insufficient hours. You see work hour fluctuation, which is really bad for parents, and a lot of labor law violations. So all of these are increasing during these years since welfare is reformed. And then, of course, these things mixed with volatile living arrangements in personal lives. So Ray McCormick, you know, she's kind of doubled up with a bunch of pseudo kin. She's really they're living in an abandoned house without any power, and they're sort of siphoning off power from from the neighbors illegally, and you know, they're figuring out ways to get water, and she's having to pay all of her earnings for a room in that house. But in return, she gets a truck to get to work, and there's supposed to be gas in that truck. And she's two-time employee of the month at Walmart. She's really proud of it. She's a good worker. She's worked since she was 16. And one day she gets into the truck to go to work, and there's no gas. Uncle George has driven up all the gas over the weekend, and no one in the house has any money to put in the tank. She calls her manager, and her manager says, you know, I've got 100 people in line for this job. If you can't get here today, don't bother coming in again. So this sense, you know, that you have these perilous jobs that don't have what all of us need, right? Give, especially when we have young children. So that was really the second stool. The third, the housing crisis. So housing instability, as you might imagine, is a hallmark of life in $2 a day poverty. While doubling up can be a source of support, for the $2 a day poor, it's more often ends in physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. So Jennifer Hernandez recalls coming into the house, they were doubled up with Uncle Jose. He was molesting her 9-year-old. She fled from the house with just clothes stuffed in pillowcases and managed to find a Goodwill who would let the family stay in an empty office. And she said to us, I never expected that. Similarly, Ray McCormick, who had lived most of her life in $2 a day poverty, related to us matter-of-factly, yeah, I've been beat, I've been raped, as if this was something that everybody experienced. And indeed, we learned in subsequent quantitative work, subsequent data work, that one of the biggest factors in the sharp rise in homeless children in the United States since the early 2000s can be directly attributed to the decline in cash welfare. So this fact that welfare is dead is really a driving force in the increase in child homelessness. So how do people survive? Well, that's the most interesting part of the book, and you should definitely get it and read it. And you know, it's a great stocking stuffer. But as you might imagine, private charity is critical. But as Ms. Arnold will tell you, the budgets of private charities are a drop in the bucket in the face of the need that we see in our communities. And it's unevenly distributed across the country. So some of the poorest places have some of the poorest charitable sectors, like the Mississippi Delta. It's not common to sell your SNAP, but it is common among the $2 a day poor. They need it to pay the light bill or to buy their kids socks and underwear. They need some cash, and they often trade their food stamps for only 50 to 60 cents on the dollar, leaving their children very, very hungry. There's old-fashioned American ingenuity. Paul Heckwilder, he and his family owned a bunch of pizza chains that all collapsed at once in the face of the Great Recession. And there were 22 people living in this tiny 2-bedroom house at one time, all surviving on his Social Security check. And he and the grandkids took the gutter apart and rigged it up over the garbage can and used that rainwater to wash the clothes. So you do see the American ingenuity. One of the most common ways of getting by was selling plasma. Jessica Compton, Travis's wife, did that twice a week. It was the only source of cash income, and this tiny little woman found it physically debilitating. And she said, especially if my iron's down, I get really tired. So when we look at other data, like, are there other signs that there's something at the bottom going on that's really different and really serious as welfare reform? We see that since the mid-1990s, the demand on food pantries is way up, and it's not just a pandemic effect. It's pretty much a monotonic rise, right? We also see that plasma donations are up. In fact, in the early 2000s, about 10,000 individual donors donated or sold their plasma. That was up to 35 million at latest count. And we mapped, Luke and his students mapped every plasma clinic in the country. And the best predictor of where a plasma clinic is located is not the rate of poverty in a census tract, but the rate of deep poverty. You probably know that 70% of the world's plasma comes from the United States because other countries don't allow people to give plasma that often. Some of you are old enough to know what I mean when I say OPEC. Some people have said that it's the US is the OPEC of plasma, but yet it's this whole industry is really on the backs of the extremely poor, the $2 a day poor. Now, all of this came home to us most profoundly in our work in the Mississippi Delta. And there we met, there you could probably throw a stone in any direction in some of these small Delta towns and find a household living in $2 a day poverty. Even people who managed to get welfare in the Mississippi Delta get paid so little, they qualify as $2 a day poor. That's how low the benefits are. Tabitha and her dozen siblings and their mother did not get anything from TANF. They did get some from food stamps. It was their only source of sustenance. Ida Mae Hicks, Tabitha's mom, sold about half of those food stamps every month to keep the lights on and keep the water on in their tiny subsidized apartment. And as a consequence, about a week and a half into the month, all of the children in the family started going hungry. And indeed, at one point, a teacher sent her a Facebook message and said, I've been watching you. She was a 5th grader since you were young, waiting for you to mature, and invited her to his house and offered her food in exchange for sex. And it took her quite a while to get out of that situation. She finally told a teacher. But when we asked her, how did it feel to be that hungry? She paused and she said, well, actually, it feels like you want to be dead because it's peaceful being dead. And that has really stayed with me. It doesn't seem like an American story in many ways. Luke, I'll turn it back over to you.
We're at an interesting moment now because Kathy and I have been thinking about, for years, what are the best ways to help Tabitha and Ray McCormick and all the families we met, Travis and Jessica Compton. And we've never wanted to go back to the old welfare system. It was a system that was highly stigmatized. Families didn't like it. The nation didn't like it. But we also think that there's a need for a cash safety net in the 21st century America, that families need the money to pay the rent or pay the utility bill or buy underwear for their kids. We also think there needs to be a focus on work. And actually, there's interesting bipartisan interest in programs the class of what's called subsidized jobs, where government and nonprofits like Miss Arnold and sometimes for-profit companies get together to try to create labor market opportunities for those who really can't compete in the private labor market. And the interesting thing about those programs is that they're always incredibly popular. They're incredibly popular with the people who would like to work but can't find work. It sort of belies the idea that people are poor as a general rule because they don't want to work. They're popular with the people who host folks. We had a very successful program during the Great Recession, and 2,000 businesses from all across the country signed a letter asking to extend it, and it wasn't extended. And they're popular with the nation. When we look at the idea of how do we create a cash safety net, Kathy and I got interested in a model that's very common in other countries called the child allowance. And the child allowance comes from a very simple principle that raising kids is expensive, and the government has a reason to help parents do their best in that work. In many other countries, they provide a small cash supplement every month to low and moderate income families, sometimes to all families. And in the United Kingdom, when we started welfare reform and said our goal is to make people work, they started a campaign that included a child benefit, a child allowance like this. And they said, you know, what we want to do is cut child poverty. And they cut child poverty in half in that period of time. So it is possible. And Canada increased their benefit quite a bit in recent years, and they had similarly dramatic poverty reductions. And interestingly, research finds that in Canada, when this child benefit was provided, one of the concerns, obviously, for a lot of people is that people will use this benefit for things that, you know, society wouldn't condone, like alcohol or tobacco, let's say. But in Canada, actually spending on those things went down when the child benefit was distributed. And the theory behind that is that sometimes substance use is a response to stress. And it turns out one thing that really stresses families is not being able to pay their basic expenses. So when there is a cash safety net, rather than increasing, it decreases. So in the United States, actually, as part of the American Rescue Plan and everything that was in that plan, one thing that we had been working on for a long time was the expansion of the child tax credit in the United States that would mirror the type of program that we have in other countries. And 1 year of funding was approved in that package. And it's going to look exactly like how I just described. It's a modest benefit. Hopefully, the plan is that it will roll out this summer, $250 per month per child, $300 for very young children, to help parents sort of pay for the expenses of parenting, whether it's childcare or saving for college or paying the utility bill or the rent. And our colleagues and friends at Columbia, who we wrote a paper years ago, sort of describing this plan, they project that this kind of program that we have for a year, it will cut child poverty by 45%. It'll cut poverty among Black children by about 50%, and among Native American children by 60%. Those are transformational numbers. And so we're really at this incredibly, pivotal moment in American history, I would say, of saying, is this something that we're going to do for a year and see what happens? Is this something we're going to do for a year and then go back to the old way of doing things? Or are we going to move into a very different future? And that is yet to be told. But I think we're both, in talking with Ray McCormick, I called Ray McCormick from our book and said, what do you think of this? And she said, that's a smart policy. That's something that can really help my family, something that I can depend on month to month. So there is a vision, right? Sometimes when you study things like poverty, you work in this area, it can feel like the problems are too big But in this case, we're actually at a moment where we could see a real change and a real different kind of future going forward. I think with that, we will pause. I think, we're professors, so we probably went longer than we should. But let me hand it over to what.
Quite all right. So thank you. Miss Arnold, could you talk to us about poverty in Tarrant County and how it compares nationally, say, and maybe some about what you do in Pathfinders, and what is your magic formula that you're able to take people out of poverty and let them become working and self-supporting?
Happy to. Well, in Tarrant County, we actually fare a little bit better than the United States at large, but in Fort Worth, we fare worse. So Fort Worth is the largest city in Tarrant County. The national poverty rate is 12.3%. Tarrant County is in the 11% range, but Fort Worth is in almost 14.5% of our poverty rate. So there's a lot to be done in our community, just as the authors found across the country. And I want to just take a minute to thank both of you, Dr. Shaefer and Dr. Edin. I so enjoyed your book. You were speaking my language. You described beautifully what it's like to live in poverty. And as you described, there's never just one issue in poverty. It's this multifaceted problem that requires a multifaceted solution. You mentioned in the book, we've been fighting the war on poverty since 1964. If there's anything we have learned, it is that there is no quick fix to poverty. And we keep, as a society, we keep wanting there to be a quick and inexpensive fix to poverty. We spend all this money, and there are ways that we could spend the same amount of money and get much different outcomes, kind of like what you just were alluding to, Dr. Shaefer. So what we do in Tarrant County is take a four-pronged approach to helping families break the cycle of generational poverty. And as I said, we all agree it's a multifaceted problem. So we try to provide a multifaceted approach to help people move out of poverty. And I will just echo what you both shared. There is no, at least we don't see, the clients with whom we work, people want to get a job. People want to be able to support their family. So Dr. Shaefer, to your point that spending on things like alcohol went down when people had a little bit of extra money, that makes sense to me. People are not, I'm always surprised if I run into somebody who believes that people are just wanting to get rich on welfare. Well, you described beautifully in your book, the math doesn't work. That's just not possible. So what I believe it takes is not only some of the policy issues that you've mentioned, but also it takes that long-term approach. So we have a long-term mentoring program with a great success rate. So we have an 89% retained employment rate. But the reason we have that, I believe, is because our mentors don't just focus on job readiness and employment coaching. They provide budgeting and financial coaching and help with decision making and goal setting and life skills. And it is that relationship based on mutual respect that really promotes change. It's not just the information, or it's not just help with rent. It's really somebody walking alongside you saying, I believe in you, and I'm going to walk alongside you as you make these changes that you want to make in your life, not what I'm telling you you should do, but what you want to do. And I think that is key. Next, we provide an asset building program. Everybody on this call knows that 63% of US families cannot cover a $400 expense. We know that life happens, it happens to all of us. If we've got resources to fall back on, then we have a chance to continue moving forward on the path to self-sufficiency. If we don't have resources to fall back on, then it's very easy to spiral back into poverty. So we believe it's really important to provide match savings to promote savings behavior so that people will have something to fall back on. While we are providing this mentoring and financial coaching to the heads of households, we also provide a 2-generation approach so that we are working with the next generation, and we're providing financial literacy and age-appropriate money management so that we're bringing the whole family along, because we know that providing opportunities and education to the next generation is a huge key to breaking the cycle of poverty. And then the fourth approach, it's just so perfectly timely, Dr. Shaefer, about what you mentioned about subsidized employment. We know that bundling services like financial coaching, you all are probably familiar with the Working Family Success Model, bundling financial coaching, employment coaching, and income support coaching, people are 3 to 4 times more likely to achieve a positive financial outcome. And so we have several subsidized employment partnerships that really work. Now, they're not as big as they need to be. We need to, Dr. Edin, to your point, we need to be able to serve more people. But we've got solutions that work. They just are not, they're not quick fixes, but they're out there. And all of the things that I've just described are all replicable, they're all scalable. They could be taken across Texas and across the nation, and many of them are. Financial coaching and asset building, those services are readily available. What is less available is a longer term approach, a 1-year program to walk alongside families to address all of the multiple barriers that they are facing in their journey to break the cycle of poverty. That long-term approach is not as available, I think, because we, again, want a quick fix. And we just need to slow down and recognize that we need to be in it for the long haul, because guess what? We're in it for the long haul. Whether we use our money on Band-Aid approaches or whether we use our money on long-term approaches, we're in it for the long haul. And so more of that, more subsidized housing, subsidized housing too, but more subsidized employment, those are keys to really moving the needle for families who are trying to break the cycle of generational poverty.
Thank you.
I could go on and on, but I'll stop until my next question.
Well, I have a quick question for Dr. Edin. And are children responsible for poverty, and would abstinence and contraception help bring people out of poverty? The reason I ask is some of the readers of your book who actually liked your book criticized it by saying, oh, the only reason those women were in poverty is because they had children. And I know you have researched this topic, so could you address that and talk about it?
Yeah, so, my first book was about how low-income single mothers make ends meet. And in the aftermath of writing that book, I did hundreds of radio and television talk shows. One day I did four in one day, one at midnight in a talk radio show in Chicago. But this question came up over and over again, Dr. Edin. If things are so hard, why did they have the kids in the first place? So I didn't, as I said, I spent my 20s talking to people about how they make ends meet, low-income single moms, but I didn't know the answer. But I did think that the people I'd been interviewing did. So I wrote my second book on that topic and interviewed several hundred women about how they see motherhood, marriage, and children. And now I'm the head of the Center for Research and Child Wellbeing at Princeton that runs the largest survey on single mothers and their children in the country. So what an irony. But just a couple of facts. First, the number of children that disadvantaged moms have now is about 2. Everybody wants 2 kids across the income divide. It's a little bit lower for the middle class, for the college educated. But if anything in this country, we're having too few kids to support our burgeoning baby boom retirement wave. So you don't want to get into a situation where you're having too few kids. Second, you know, that age, that family size has gone down very quickly over time. Third, the age at first childbirth has gone up to about, for the most disadvantaged, about 22, 23 for women. It's about 2 years older for men. So, you know, this is when our parents had their children. It's just that the college educated have pushed childbearing very late into the 20s and even into the 30s. And then finally, there is a very strong sense among disadvantaged youth that they aspire to marriage, but children are a key source of meaning and identity. And you know, it's like while they're waiting for the perfect situation, that may never come because disadvantage, as Ms. Arnold said, is hard to shake. They're not going to forego the thing that makes life worth living more than anything else. So, you know, they have the children. We've followed those moms over time now with the Fragile Families Survey, and many of them do figure it out. I mean, those kids are still more disadvantaged. You know, even if you follow them through age 15 and beyond than kids born in 2-parent married families. But many of them do quite well. There's a lot of heterogeneity in their outcomes. So it's a common question, and it's one that I always say, if you want to help someone wait to have their kid, you know, at the ideal time, give them something to live for, give them a vision, give them a sense of the future, because that's what they're looking for. And that's the whole that these kids are fulfilling. And so, you know, if that's the only game in town, then it's going to be kids. But if there's a real sense that there's a future, there's other ways of filling that key need of all young adults for a sense of meaning and identity. And that's what programs like Ms. Arnold's mentoring, those kinds of programs can really provide that.
Thank you. Ms. Arnold, I have another question for you. Has anyone worked out the dollars and cents, like how much does it cost and all the resources you put towards to a family with, say, 2 kids to try and get them out of poverty? If you were to add all of that money up, how much would it cost to bring a family out of poverty? Has anyone done those numbers?
We've done the numbers, but of course it's not a simple answer. So it costs $3,300 to mentor a family for a year. And one of the things we talk about is we compare that with the $37,000 plus that I mentioned that it takes for a family to be on all the subsidies that we're talking about: TANF, SNAP, subsidized housing, et cetera, et cetera. So that right there tells you it's a huge ROI to spend the money to put a family through a program that really works. But as I say that, you know, poverty is so complex. So for one family, going through our program really might be what they need to work with a mentor. I've got example after example of families who work with mentors, work on job readiness and employment coaching, and they're able to get a job and they're able to graduate from our program and slowly transition off of some of these other supports. But for other families, they might need vocational training or the subsidized employment that we were talking about. So that $3,300 that I reference is again for our program. But if you need to layer, just to give you a point of reference, say you need to layer vocational training. About the most expensive vocational training out there is about $6,500. So even if you add that to the $3,300, and even if you add subsidized employment and add transportation help, you still are looking at a really significant ROI, because if we bundle those services, and we're able to help somebody transition to self-sufficiency, then the hope, the goal is that they continue on that journey to self-sufficiency, and they don't fall back into the welfare system if they're lucky enough to get a cash assistance or SNAP or subsidized housing. So that's a starting point to think about dollars and cents. Dr. Shaefer could probably look at all of the data and get back with us with a number that would include all of those other support that some families need.
The reason I ask is, even with all the expenses to get a family through, it probably sounds like less money than they spend to keep someone in the county jail or the state prison for a year.
Absolutely.
It sounds like a reasonable investment. And the other question, are nonprofits, and I know it's you and I know some of the churches have similar mentorship programs to bring people out of poverty, but can nonprofits possibly raise enough money to meet the need of people who are willing to go through the program, or is it going to require state or federal assistance?
I think the best, we have a wonderful partnership with our Workforce Development Board in Tarrant County. And let me back up and answer your question. Can local nonprofits do it alone? No. And is there the opportunity for some beautiful and very successful relationships with the government? Yes. And so let me share an example with you. So we have a wonderful partnership with our Workforce Development Board, where we provide the mentoring that I've talked about, the financial coaching, the job readiness, the life skills, all the things I described. And they provide subsidized employment, or they provide an opportunity for vocational training and then subsidized employment. We also have partnerships within the nonprofit community that provide vocational training. And so no one entity can do it alone, and no, the nonprofit sector can't do it alone. We're always going to have a need for safety net in our country, I believe.
Dr. Kelly, we have a question from one of our attendees.
Go ahead.
Are you ready for audience questions?
Dr. Shaefer?
So
You need to unmute.
So Dr. Kelly, here's a question from Sanford Thatcher. It says, Alaska has its permanent fund that provides every Alaskan with a certain annual income. Since it is based on monies from the oil and gas industry, would that work in Texas?
I have a student who's studying that guaranteed benefit, and it really ebbs and flows depending on the state coffers. But it's a fairly small benefit, but I don't think we know. I don't know what the impact of the benefit is, and hopefully my student will be able to tell us. But we do have these sort of guaranteed income experiments going on all around the country, and I think in general the results are fairly positive.
Yeah, the evidence that we have on the Alaska Permanent Fund is quite positive on food insecurity and other outcomes. It's a little complicated, just as Kathy said, because when times are good, the benefit gets bigger. So that that becomes difficult for us researchers to figure out how much is it just that times are better and people are doing better. But it is very interesting in that it's very popular again, right? And so it's really a matter of like how we conceptualize resources. And so I can't answer the question for Texas, but I can answer the question that is, you know, essentially a guarantee, that is a sort of a common income, and it's popular in a relatively conservative state. And so thinking about what that would mean in Texas, I think is a really interesting idea that I would encourage people to really reflect on. I will say that, you know, welfare, cash welfare was an incredibly unpopular program. But when you think about like the stimulus payments, the ones that just came out as part of the American Rescue Plan and the ones that we did last year, those were incredibly popular, right? Those are, you know, the $1,400 payments, that sent more money to poor families than the entire annual budget of TANF, you know, by leaps and bounds. But it was more popular because it folded everyone into the same program. So that to me is the best evidence that we have. And the evidence, by the way, on those programs during the COVID era, right, those stimulus checks and the expansion of unemployment insurance is utterly staggering, right? So I can remember the first day I realized what an incredible economic crisis we were heading into last spring. I had utter panic. I didn't understand the public health crisis, but I was quite certain that we were going to see incredibly long lines at food banks, that we were going to see a lot of hardship. And that's how it started. But then the response of the federal government was to expand access to unemployment insurance in ways they've never done before. It was a bipartisan response. And these economic stimulus payments. And the results have been staggering. Somebody mentioned the percentage of Americans have a hard time who don't think they could manage a $400 expense. The number of poor Americans who said they can't manage a $400 expense actually went down last summer during the COVID crisis. It improved. Loan delinquencies went down. People, you know, it turns out when you give people money, they do crazy things like pay their rent, and they pay their mortgage, and they pay their auto loans. And credit scores went up. And all of these markers of hardship actually improved. So, you know, I worry about the idea of a guaranteed basic income, because I think we don't know, to do that means really changing the way society works in a serious way. But the success of that response, this bipartisan response during the COVID era, sends me a lot further down that road than I've ever been before, to say that's a good foundation. It's not going to replace what Ms. Arnold and her group does, because Kathy and I also believe people really need to be folded into society. Yeah. And mentoring is really a crucial element to that, having these connections and not dividing. But this sort of broad-based way of, you know, this sort of libertarian idea that say, when we need to help people, let's help as many people as we can in the same bucket and do it in the simplest way possible, seems to have worked in a way that before COVID, I never would have imagined.
So here's another question from the chat box, this time from Nancy Laverty. I'll read the first one only. It says, how much would supporting fledgling women-owned businesses help, including providing microloans? Oh, and then she goes on to say, does that have value without also providing mentoring on finances, business planning, etc.?
Luke, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you my opinion on that, which I think entrepreneurial programs are great. It's great to think about how we can empower folks to create things. It's not going to be the big solution, in my view. It's not going to be the thing. There's just not going to be thousands or millions of people who start their own businesses and from nothing and create tons and tons of jobs. So that's why, you know, we tend to focus on things like subsidized jobs programs, where we create more slots for people, cash transfer, mentoring programs, all of those types of things. One answer to this particular question is microloans are great. I'm actually kind of a libertarian. I don't know. I'm in my libertarian streak these days because I'm a big fan of reducing occupational licensures. Now, what does that mean? It turns out there are all these, you know, requirements to do any sort of types of work. And a lot of times we don't need those requirements at all, right? We don't need people to pay $500 to get a certificate to walk dogs. You know, there's literally thousands of these things on the books. I've done work in the dental field on this to say, like, maybe there are things that dentists could do that hygienists could do, and they require a lot less training. And that means more folks who are low income might have a chance of getting to that place. What about lawyers, right? How much of the work that law firms do could actually be taken on by folks with a lot less training? So that's where I would focus my efforts, but I'm all for microloans. I think they can be very positive and empowering, but looking for the structural solutions and particularly breaking down those barriers so that people can do meaningful work that we tend to restrict to not let people do when they could actually do it well. I think that's probably the bigger bang for the buck in that sort of domain.
Dr. Kelly, do we have time for another question?
Yes, you do. Go ahead.
Okay, so this is from the Q&A box from Pat Carter, who says, to what degree does a sense of community give impoverished folks the courage to go on?
We asked every person in our book at the end of the many months and years that we interviewed them, you know, if what was it like being part of the study? And almost to a person, they said something like this: if my struggles, my story could help even one person, it will all have been worth it. And as we talked to people more and more, we realized that the thing they wanted more than anything else, more than handouts, is they wanted to contribute. They wanted to contribute to their communities. They wanted to feel a sense of dignity in being a valued member of their communities. And you know, sometimes when we do charity work, both the government and the nonprofit sector, we unintentionally divide. You know, we push people over here. In the old welfare system, before welfare reform, right, for that little bit of money, you had to trade away your dignity. It was almost as if you had to give up your citizenship card. And there's more and more evidence now that actually treating people in that way, in a way that denies them their citizenship and denies them dignity, is like a sucker punch in the gut, and actually reduces their working memory and other cognitive resources that could help them get ahead. So in shaming people, we might be actually prohibiting them from experiencing mobility from poverty. So this is such a great question. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to wrap our arms around all of our citizens. You know, H&R Block has this ad. It has all the H&R Block people. And it's, you know, because H&R Block is where you get your earned income tax credit. It's the whole tax industry is, you know, based on that, on low-income people getting their tax credits, the low-income workers. And it says, your people are our people. In other words, you know, you're part of us. You're inside of the circle. And people over and over again in interviews tell us about that ad. They say, gee, you know, I'm a low-wage worker. I work at McDonald's, but I went to H&R Block and they said, your people are our people. Have you seen that ad? You know, this idea that I'm part of something. I'm a worker. I'm part of society. I'm valued for my contributions. So it's just it's a kind of a litmus test that Luke and I have derived And you know, like when we come and meet you in person, maybe sometime, we'll take you through a whole exercise where you can score social problems on the degree to which they lend dignity rather than shame. And we'll share creative ideas that Ms. Arnold has already thought of about how you might do that.
Okay, thank you. We're almost at the end of the hour, but do you have time for a few more questions?
Sure.
Okay. Robert Ortega has a question for the panelists. Apparently, guaranteed basic income has a long history in the US and has seen various attempts at implementation. What could be the possibility of such a system being seriously undertaken on a large scale? And could this help to reduce poverty? Also, what are the thoughts on the recent experiments in Stockton and Oakland, California with such programs? I'm not familiar with those programs. Are you in California? You are?
I'll just start and then Luke can finish. But
All
yes,
right.
the first guaranteed income experiments were actually done during the Nixon administration, the Seattle and Denver income maintenance experiment. And Richard Nixon proposed under his family assistance plan to make this national policy, but it did not happen. So history is fascinating, but I'll let Luke talk about Oakland and Stockton.
Yeah, there are two sort of versions of this program. One is the negative income tax, and the idea for that is that we're going to bring everybody up to a certain level, a base level, and that has the benefit of being cheaper, and that's why Milton Friedman sort of recommended it, really became the champion of it, saying, you know what? Let's just reduce all the bureaucracy. Let's stop spending all this money on different programs and just, you know, provide people with the money. A guaranteed basic income says, well, it's hard to figure out who is sort of right below that line and who is right above that line. So we want to give some amount of money to everyone, sort of up the income ladder, rather than figuring out who's below this sort of whatever we think is reasonable. And in that way, it's a lot simpler, right? But you got to figure out where the money comes from. And in the United States, no one's really quite figured that out yet. When we, you know, basically, if you do the back of the envelope math, you're talking about doubling the size of the federal government.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, with that, we're sort of in the stage of an interesting idea and something that actually spans the political spectrum. So you have very conservative thinkers and very liberal thinkers who like the idea of a guaranteed basic income, and then very conservative and very liberal thinkers who really don't like it. And so that way it's sort of interesting to us. There are all these experiments going on. The one in Stockton, you know, it's the results are interesting. It's a little bit hard to sort of figure out what the counterfactuals are, and you know, if the impacts are really what the study suggested. But we have tons of studies from various places, and the general findings are it reduces hardship, that people use the money to for their basic expenses, that it can reduce things like criminal justice engagement. It can improve academic scores in the long run, reduces substance use. So, you know, various levels of how much you provide and when you provide it, these are all really important questions. So it really provides a foundation, right? It's not going to make everybody's problems go away. It provides a foundation which we can then build on, right, if we stabilize families. So I think Kathy and I were not quite ready to sort of say do a guaranteed basic income, and we haven't totally figured out how to do a negative income tax that doesn't have this stigmatizing effect, although we remain really interested in both things. But the child allowance is something that like we can afford, right? So this is something that we can put into place. We can have it sort of help both poor families and middle income families, and into one program, not stigmatize poor kids. and we can reduce child poverty by 45%, right? And so in that way, this is a very conservative policy in that, like, it's been tried in dozens of other countries for decades, and the results have been very positive. That's something we can adopt, and I think we can move from there to say, what should we do from here? Should we extend this? You know, just the final word is actually we have a pretty good guaranteed basic income in this country in Social Security. It just happens to be for the elderly, right? This is a program that virtually everyone becomes eligible for. It's ostensibly connected to work, but it's sort of everybody works enough to get it. And something like 37% of the elderly would be in poverty if it weren't for that program.
Yeah.
Yet that group is the one, you know, the elderly are the folks who have the lowest rates of food insecurity. They have the lowest rates of having trouble meeting their housing and utility bills. So that's probably a program I would not mess with, right? Because it's been so incredibly successful for so long. So I think we can take that, sort of do a very similar thing with children, and then figure out what to do from there.
We have one last question. Dr. Balby, do you want to read it?
I'd be happy to. This is from Karen Green. What are some of the misconceptions about the issues of poverty which you believe are impediments to the successful implementation of policies which could address the issues?
So I love that question. For 400 years in this country, we've been operating under a central premise. And we've all thought it at one time or another. So I'm not pointing any fingers here, but that poverty is a moral problem. And because we've thought of poverty as a moral problem, and we've been terrified of dependence, so we used to call it pauperism, we've made being poor as miserable as possible. Back in the old days, you know, 400 years ago in Puritan villages, a widow could get food or fuel from the town, but not both. And we've always, you know, food stamps, we know, only provide enough food for 2.5 weeks in the month. We've always designed our programs. You know, I think that the maximum benefit in Texas for a family of 3 who manages to get cash welfare is about $200 if they have no other cash income. So we've always done this, right? We've created these programs that people can't possibly survive on because we're terrified of dependency. But what the new research is really showing us is that's costly. That in and of itself, that sense of social rejection and pushing people out of the community, right? It's saying your people are not our people, can actually be an impediment to moving from poverty. And if you want people to have the bandwidth, the working memory to plan ahead, to benefit from Ms. Arnold's program and the mentorship, the budgeting classes, they need those psychological resources to move ahead, and they need the community to put its arms around them. So I always tease I'm not a Republican, but I have a lot of Republican friends, and I always tease them that they just love to wag their finger. You know, and I said, if you just stop doing that, you might get more done. We all want the same thing. So maybe we should try this new approach of wrapping our arms around people rather than the stigma, the shame, and the meanness of anti-poverty policy in the history of the U.S.
I would just echo, we all want the same thing. The families with whom we work want exactly what we all want for our families. And so I think that some of the biggest misconceptions are that either people that are in poverty don't get to choose those same wants that we get to choose, or that they are lazy. And our experience time and time again is that people who are struggling to break the cycle of poverty are the most incredibly resilient group of people with whom I've ever worked. They keep going, they get knocked down and they keep getting at, and they keep trying the next thing and taking the bus for 2 hours to get to work and doing all of those things that we don't want to do. I want to be able to drive to work. I don't want to add 2 hours to my work day. people in poverty are just like people who aren't in poverty, and they want the same thing. They just often have had less opportunities.
On this note, I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you for a truly fascinating conversation. Clearly, there is so much more to learn on this topic, and perhaps here's an idea for a future follow-up event. On behalf of the Yale Club of Fort Worth and of our partner clubs tonight, I'd like to offer huge thanks to Dr. Kathryn Edin, to Dr. Luke Shaefer, and to Ms. Kathryn Arnold. And thank you, Dr. Marie Kelly, for superbly leading tonight's presentation. And finally, special thanks to Mrs. Maricar Estrella Hastings of the Yale Club of Fort Worth. Please mark next week, Tuesday, April 27th at 4 p.m. as we will present a conversation on the Jackson School of Global Studies with Pericles Lewis, Vice President for Global Strategy at Yale University. We hope to see you then. A recording of tonight's session will be posted on the Yale Club of Fort Worth website, ycfw.org, and on our YouTube channel. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a good evening.